It is again time for a practice project. A project where we can practice a lot of the things you learned throughout this entire course, and of course, especially throughout the previous modules. And therefore, in this module here, we'll again build a complete web page, a basic web page. This time, a web page where we will also work with a third-party library, Google Maps, to allow users to get the current location of a user or to enter an address and then get the location of that address and display it on a map and to then share that place with other users. This is what we're going to build, and throughout this module we'll therefore encounter a couple of the concepts we learned in the last modules or in this entire course, and of course in general this will be a great practice to work with JavaScript. Now for that, to get started, attached you find a little starting project, and there I already set up Webpack for you. So we will use Webpack to bundle our code. In Webpack we also use Babel to translate our code to older JavaScript code that runs in older browsers as well. For that, in the package.json file, I got a browsers list entry where you see that I target browsers which have at least a market share of 0.5%. And in this folder, you find a dist folder. There we got HTML files in the root folder and in the MyPlace subfolder with some basic HTML code in there, as you can tell. This is all prepared for you so that we don't have to write it here. In the assets folder in the dist folder, you find a styles folder with a couple of styles, and these style files are already getting imported in the HTML files, as you can tell. And we got a scripts folder which is empty, because we'll not write our scripts and put them in here. Instead, we will write our scripts here in the source folder, where I have two empty scripts files for you to start with. And Webpack will then take these two script files, so we got two different entry points, and build bundles based on these script files and place them in the dist assets scripts folder, and that's where I'm also pointing at in my HTML files. So here I try to import these script files which will be generated there. So this is our starting setup, and with that starting setup we can start write some code here in the source folder in the JavaScript files and make sure that we build a nice application where in the end users are able to pick a location either by entering an address or by auto-locating themselves. And then we want to display that location on a map. For that, we'll use Google Maps, and you'll see how to integrate that library into this project. And with all of that, we'll then be able to create a link which can be shared also with the clipboard API so that people don't have to manually use Ctrl+C to copy the link. And that link will load that other HTML page and display the place there. That is the goal, and for that we'll dive into many concepts we saw and also a couple of new concepts. Now to get started, we should run this build dev script here, which spins up the Webpack dev server. So you can open the terminal, which is integrated into Visual Studio Code, to have a terminal or command prompt which is automatically navigated into that folder, and then simply run npm run build:dev to spin up that development server. And of course then, as you learned it, keep that server running so that whenever you change something in your source JavaScript files, it will automatically rebuild and reload the page. With it running, you can visit localhost 8080 here, and this is what we start with. Right now, if I press these buttons, of course, nothing will happen. Indeed, when we press find place, we even reload the page. And these are, of course, all things we'll work on. With that, let's get started writing some code. Now to get started with some code, I want to start in the share place.js file, which is the JavaScript file that ultimately gets imported here in that root index.html file. This is the file which will be responsible for controlling what we have here in the end, for controlling the different buttons we got there to find a place by address or to get the current user location. So we'll start in the share place.js file, and now we have an important decision to make. Do we want to use an object-oriented style where we work with classes, or do we want to use a more functional programming style where we only work with different functions that do stuff and don't organize our codes in classes? There is no wrong or right choice here, but I will go for the object-oriented approach also to make sure that we can practice working with classes again. And therefore here in the shared place.js file, I'll create a new class and I will name it place finder. Now you can name that class whatever you want, of course. You should just follow that naming convention where you start with an uppercase character and then you have one word where every word in the word also starts with a new uppercase character. And this will be my central class for hooking up all these buttons we got in our HTML page for getting an address or for getting a place. So find place and get current location. These two buttons should be managed by this class in the end. So inside of the place finder, I'll start by making sure that we get access to these buttons and that we add event listeners to them. So I want to get access to this find place button, or since it's of type submit and inside of a form, I actually want to get access to this form here and listen to the submit event. And I want to get access to this get current location button and listen to a click on it. So for that, we can go into share place.js. And here in the class, add a constructor so that we have some code that runs right away when we create a new instance of this class. Now in there, I want to get access to my address form and I want to get access to the locate user button. Now for the address form to get access, we can use document query selector and then just query for the first form element we find, because it turns out that on this index.html file, we only got one form element. So of course we'll find that and we'll have access to the form I want to have access to. For the locate user button here, I want to get access to this button. And as you can see, this button got an ID. So one way of getting access to the button would be to use that ID. So we can just do document get element by ID and enter that ID here. With that, we got access to these two DOM elements and we store references to these elements in these two constants. Now we can also add event listeners to these buttons, and we can do that right here in the constructor if we want to. We can go to the locate user button and add an event listener, a click event listener, where I want to fire some method, which we have to add to this class, that should get the user location. So let's add a new method here. Maybe locate user handler is a fitting name. Again, I like that pattern where the methods or the functions that are attached to an event end with handler. It's not a must do. It's just one convention which I sometimes like to use. And then this will be the method I want to trigger when we click that button. So here we can point at locate user handler. Don't execute it as you learned. Instead, just point at it so that JavaScript and the browser can execute this function for us, or this method for us, whenever this event occurs. Now I also will need another method because we also got the address form here, and of course there I also want to add an event listener. Here, however, to the submit event, and then here again we want to trigger a method. And you can name this method however you want, of course. I will name it find address handler because that's ultimately what this method will do, and therefore here we can point at this find address handler. With that, we got the two buttons connected, or we got the two events connected, and now we can start with either of the two things. I will start with getting the user location here. Now, how do we get the user location? You learned that for that you can use Navigator geolocation. Geolocation is a browser API that is provided in JavaScript that allows us to get the user's location. If we search for MDN geolocation, we find the official MDN documentation on this API. And what you'll see here, if you scroll down, is that this has quite decent browser support. The geolocation API here has really good support. Internet Explorer 9 and higher supports it, Safari supports it, so this should really work in all the browsers we're targeting. Nonetheless, if you want to be super safe, you can add a if check here and check if navigator.geolocation is a thing, or to be precise, if it's not a thing by adding an exclamation mark in front of that. And if we make it into this if block, we know that we don't have access to the geolocation API. And in that case, we might want to return and not continue here with this function and simply throw an alert or show an alert to the user where we say location feature is not available in your browser. Please use a more modern browser or manually enter an address. So here my fallback code is that I tell the user who might be using my web page here that we can't auto-locate him because it's just not supported by the browser, and that therefore the fix for the user is to either use a more modern browser or use that alternative of entering an address here. And with that, I think we're really doing our best here to make sure that we support this feature and give a helpful feedback if it's not available. Now, after this if check, so if we don't make it in there, and if we would make it in here, we would return. So if we make it past this if check, we know that geolocation is available. Well, then I indeed want to get the current location of the user. So for that, we can use navigator geolocation here, and then call get current position. This will get the current position of the user, and it takes two callback arguments here, which we can pass in, which will be the two functions in the end, which will be triggered when we either succeed getting the position or when we fail. So here we either get a success result in the first callback function, and I'm just passing in an anonymous arrow function here. This will be the argument automatically given to us by this browser API if we succeed, or we make it into this second callback, the second argument here, which I pass in. This would be my anonymous function that gets triggered if we fail to get the user location. Now let's start with the fail case. If we do fail to get the location here, well, then I want to show an alert where I just say, could not locate you, unfortunately. Please enter an address manually. So again, even if we fail to automatically get the location here, we do offer an alternative to our users that tell them what they can do to still use our application. And of course, that is something you want to do in your applications so that you provide a good user experience. In the success result, on the other hand, we know, or we will get the user location data, and we know that it succeeded. So that is where we will later then display the map in the end. So here for the moment, I just want to get my coordinates, and I can get them out of my success result argument here. And my coordinates should be a new object here where I have a latitude, so a lat key, and where I have a lng, a long key. And by the way, of course, you could create a new class for this, which you then just create with the new keyword to make sure that you always have the correctly named properties in there. Here, I'll do it on the fly with this object literal notation. So my latitude can be received from success result dot coords dot latitude. I also get auto-completion here. If you want to see what else is in success result, you can of course always console log success result. That would be possible. But here I know that my latitude will be stored here, and here for success result, I got my longitude. Now, one thing I will do here, which you of course don't need for the application in general, but which I want to have here, is I'll add math random times 50. And I'll add this to both, and I'm just doing this so that I can show you the result without you being able to locate me here. Sorry about that, but I don't want to expose my address here, so that's what I'm doing here. Of course, you would omit this. This is not needed for the app. This will actually ensure that we're not getting the correct position. You, of course, want to get the correct position. I'm just doing this here to kind of not show my exact location here. So with that, we got the coordinates, and for the moment, we can just console log them to see that it worked. Of course, later we'll change this and make sure that we don't just log them, but that we use them to show this on a map. Now, with that, we need to make sure that we, of course, trigger our constructor here for the place finder, and we do that by instantiating place finder. So here below my class, I will call new place finder, and actually that's all I gotta do here. We don't even need to store the instance in any constant because I'm not doing anything with the instance. I just want it to exist. Of course, you could nonetheless store it in a constant if you wanted to. With that, if you save that, and you then click on get current location, you should be asked by your browser whether you want to allow this. And here I do want to allow this. And thereafter we'll need to wait. We probably should add some kind of feedback here, and then we get back a location here. So I get back a location here, and therefore this works. Now before we start displaying this on any map, let's make sure that we provide some feedback to the user that tells the user that something is happening, so that whilst we're waiting for the location to be fetched, now in the second and third time this is super fast, but whilst we're waiting for this to happen, we actually get some spinner or some feedback that shows, hey, something is happening, don't worry. How can we show some feedback to our users? Well, if you go into the root index.html file here, you'll see that there I prepared two templates. One for a modal in general, with a backdrop we can display and with a modal container, and then one for the content of such a modal we could display. And I'm splitting this up so that theoretically we could display a modal with any content to have the general container and look, and then insert different pieces of content. Now here I only need one specific piece of content. I want to show a modal, so an overlay on the screen, which shows a loading spinner. And this will display a loading spinner because I also give you the extra CSS code, which you find in here in app.js, to generate such a loading spinner, all with CSS. So this is something we can utilize here. And for that, I want to be able to display a modal, so such an overlay. And I'll do this in a new class. I'll even do it in a new file, in a new subfolder in my source folder. I'll name the folder UI for a user interface. So these should be some general user interface components, if you want to call them like this. And in there, I want to add a modal.js file. Now this is a JavaScript file which should be responsible for displaying a modal and rendering content in there. Now, of course, there are different ways of creating such a modal, but here I will create a class, modal, and in there, I want to have a couple of methods that help us control this modal. To be precise, there should be two methods, a show method and a hide method. And a modal is simply an overlay on the screen. And with show, I want to be able to show such an overlay. With hide, I want to be able to hide it. Now, I also need a constructor, and in there, I want to be able to get the information which content should be shown. And then we can create different instances of this modal class with different content we're passing into the constructor so that we always will use the same frame here, the same backdrop, but we can pass in different content. So for that in modal.js here, in the constructor, we could expect a content ID argument here, for example. So the ID of the template or of the HTML tag that holds our content. And then in here, in the constructor, I want to create two new properties. A content template element. Again, this is a property because we store it with the help of the this keyword, where I get my element by ID, the content ID. So this will give me access to the template element in the DOM that has this ID. So for example, if we want to show the loading spinner, the template ID would be this ID. We pass this to the modal class and we would get access to this template DOM element. Now we also need the modal itself, so the backdrop and the container. And for that, I'll get my modal template element with document get element by ID. And there I want to get this ID. Modal template is the ID, and that's therefore the ID I will fetch here. And of course, my mistake, content ID here should not be a string. I instead want to use this argument here, which in turn should hold a string. But I want to use the argument here so that this is really dynamic. So with that, we get access to the elements we need to render the modal. Now, when show is getting called, I want to use these elements to bring them on the screen and, well, show them there. Now, for that, we can use our template tag here. And before we do so, let's search for MDN template to find the documentation on this template tag. And there, if we scroll down to the bottom, we see it's actually not supported in Internet Explorer. So there, this might not work. Hence, there, I actually want to be able to, well, to have a little fallback or at least something on the screen. So we can't use our template there. Therefore, you actually might want to implement a bigger workaround around this issue. Here, I want to check if the template tag is available, and if it's not, well, then I want to do something which could replace this modal here. We can check if the template is available by checking if the content property is available in document create element template. Now this is a weird syntax. What am I doing here? Document create element creates a new DOM element and I create a template element. Now on Internet Explorer, this will fail because Internet Explorer doesn't know that. Therefore in Internet Explorer, this is basically undefined. And with the in keyword, we can check if this object here on the right, and every element, every DOM element is just an object, as you learned, if it has this property. And if this is undefined, as it would be on Internet Explorer, then this here would of course not exist as a property, and therefore this would yield false. So we would not make it into this if block. So if we don't support the template tag, and this is simply a little trick for checking if we do, well then we make it into the else block. And here you want to have some fallback code to do something else instead of showing this overlay here. You could, for example, show an alert. So you could show an alert, and here you could get some fallback text here and then store this here. This fallback text is fallback text, so that we store this in a property, and here we could show our fallback text. This would be a very basic workaround, but it would be a workaround where we at least show something to the user in case our template is not supported. Now, depending on which kind of application you're building and what you plan on doing in the modal, if it's more than just showing a loading spinner, then you might need a bigger workaround. You might need to be more flexible and build your application in a totally different way. Here, this fallback text should be all we need, and therefore this is the approach I'll go for if the template tag is not supported, which we check with this approach. If we do make it into this if block, we know the template tag is available, so selecting the template tag here in the DOM, will work, and we can use that to render our modal, our overlay, onto the screen. For that, I can first of all get my modal content by calling document import node. This is how you use the content of a template and create a node based on it. And here I want to point at the modal template element, so for the modal and the backdrop itself, and there at the content property, which exists there, and pass in true so that we make a deep clone in the end. So what this will do is, this will give us access to these two divs here in the end, and they are in the end stored in our modal content. Now, so not the content we want to display in there, maybe that's a bit deceiving, let's maybe name it modal elements instead. That's what we have access to here. It's one object which in the end gives us access to the backdrop div and the modal div. Now, of course, I need access to specifically the modal div or the backdrop div. For that, we can build up on modal elements there. So I can get my modal element here by using modal elements, so this constant we just created here, and there we can use query selector and then dot modal to get access to the element with the class, the CSS class modal, which is this div here. And for the backdrop, we can do the same with the backdrop class. So here we can duplicate this and have our backdrop element here with the backdrop class we're selecting. So now we got access to the two elements that we need as a frame and as a background for our modal overlay. Now we just need to get access to the actual content we want to display in there. So here I'll create a new constant now, content element, and we can get this with document import node, and then this content template element dot content, and also create a true deep clone here with true as a second argument. And this gives us access to the actual content we want to display based on the content ID we got here in our constructor. So now we got all the pieces together. Now we just need to add it to the page. So first of all, on the modal element itself, I will append or append child, if you want to have best cross-browser support, my content element. And then we need to add the modal element and the backdrop element into our DOM. For that, we can use document body and use insert adjacent element, which you learned about, and then after begin to basically add it inside of the body, but right at the beginning of the body, the modal element, and then repeat that for the backdrop element. And now when we call show here on that modal, we should be able to show it. Let's test this, and let's go back to share place, to the share place JS file. And in there, we now need access to the modal, which we create, to the modal class here, which we create in modal.js. Well, actually, to have that access, we should export it here first. So in modal.js, export the modal class. In share place.js, we can now import it. So here we can import something from ./UI/modal without .js. Webpack will add that for us, so just like this. And now here, the something I import is the modal class. So we're using a named import here because we have a named export here in the modal.js file. So now we import that here in the place finder, or next to the place finder class, I should say. Therefore, we can use it in the place finder class. Here, when we actually start getting the user location, at this point, I want to create the modal, and I want to get rid of it when we were successful or when we failed. Even if we failed, I want to get rid of the modal because we're done trying to get the user location at least. So here I get my modal with new modal. And now there we need to pass in 2 arguments. The first argument is the ID of our content, which is loading modal-content. So let's copy that string here and pass this as a first argument. Second argument is the fallback text, loading location, please wait. And that would be the text for the alert we show if the template tag is not supported. And then we can call modal show. And now in success result, I want to call modal hide, and this will of course only execute once this anonymous function executes, which only happens once we got the user location. Or if we failed, I'll of course do the same, so that in this case we also hide the modal. And with all of that, if we go back and we click on get current location, you should see that overlay, and that should stay there until we get the user location. But right now it's not getting hidden because at the moment in our modal, the hide method is not doing anything. So that will be the next thing we do. And of course, feel free to first try it on your own before we now implement this functionality together. So let's make sure we can also hide the modal now. And to hide the modal, we basically need to remove the backdrop and the modal element from the DOM. To remove these elements here, I will store modal element in a property, not in a constant, and the same here for backdrop, so that they're not just constants that are available in the show method, but properties of the entire modal class, or of the instance we create based on the class, to be precise. So that we can not just use them here in the show method, but in all methods of this class. Therefore here, of course, whenever we use modal element, we need to use this modal element. And also down there, when we append it to the DOM, we need to use this modal element and this backdrop element, because these are no longer variables or constants of this method. These are now properties of the class instance. Now we can use modal element and backdrop element also in hide. And in hide, I first of all want to check if we have a modal element, modal element, just to be sure that before I try to remove it, that we at least have it. And then we can use document body, remove child, this modal element. Alternatively, on more modern browsers, you can simply use this modal element remove. And of course, also use document body remove child, this backdrop element, so that we remove the backdrop, the background behind the modal as well. And then I'll set this modal element to null and this backdrop element to null. And I do this to tell JavaScript that these properties are cleared and that the references to the DOM elements are no longer needed and can be cleaned up so that we don't have them in memory and create memory leaks. That's why I set these 2 properties to null thereafter. This is one use case where setting something to null makes sense, because I want to make it clear that this is reset and that I don't need these elements anymore. Now with that, if we save that and we go back and click on get current location, we see that spinner here, but as soon as we got the location, it indeed is removed. So that is working. The second and the other times are way faster, which is why we only see this blink up, but it generally works as we want. And with that, we get the modal finished, and we can move right away to the next step and make sure that we now also display a map with a pin on the place of the location the user got. So let's make sure we can display a map as well. For that, I got this area up here. There, I want to render the map once we got the user location. And for that, I will use Google Maps. Now, to use Google Maps, you can just Google for Google Maps SDK, and you should find various results, and at some point, the Google Maps platform here, which you can get started with. On this page, you see an overview of the different things Google Maps offers to you, and there the JavaScript API is interesting to us. So we can click on JavaScript API here, and here you can learn way more about this library, which you in the end have here, which you can integrate into your project. And I can only recommend diving into this documentation if you want to deeply dive into Google Maps and what you can do with it in JavaScript. There is a bunch you can do with it, because in the end, Google Maps, the web page which you can visit, is built with that, you can say. We'll build a basic map though, and for that we can add this import here, which you find in this snippet, to our project. Well, we cannot do that. We have to do that. So you can copy that and then go back to your code. And here in the index.html file, above our JavaScript file, you can add this import. Now, please note that this import has this your API key thing here. And it has this callback thing. You can remove the callback thing here right away. This would allow you to execute a JavaScript function right away once this is loaded, something I don't want to do here. But we have to add something for the your API key thing. And we see it's also highlighted here in this example. Now, to use Google Maps, you need a Google account and you need to set up a project with Google. Now, that is generally free to use, but you can learn more on the pricing page. You have to have an account and you need a credit card, unfortunately, but the first $200 of usage you have in every month is free. And $200, that's a lot of usage. Now you can dive into here and you can learn what you can do with Google Maps for $200 and what everything costs. And it's really not expensive. So with $200, you can do a lot, and you can certainly do what we do here in this project without paying anything. But you need a Google account with a credit card. Unfortunately, there is no way around that. So make sure you sign in with your Google account or create one if you don't have one already. And once you did log in, you can click on Get Started here, and you should get this overlay here. Now there, pick Maps and also already pick Places. We'll need that later. So check these two boxes and click on Continue. And then select the project, and there you can simply create a new one by clicking on Create a New Project. And I'll name this JS Complete My Places. You can pick any name you want here in the end. Click on Next, and now this will take a while. So let's wait for that to finish. And you should be forwarded to the Google Cloud Maps platform. Now here, confirm that for this account you want to set up billing. Now again, you got these $200 of free usage, so you'll not actually have to pay something for the amount of usage we have here in this app, but you need to confirm that you want to be able to pay at least. And with that, you can click on Next here, and now wait for that to finish. You see the same kind of overlay we built here in the end, by the way. And then you get this API key. Now, the one you see here will be invalid by the point of time you're watching this, so definitely use your own one. You can't use mine. Use this key, however, and plug it in here where you saw your API key, so that in the end here you have key equals and then that key here, which you find in this box. With that key added here, we're importing the Google Maps JavaScript SDK and we can use it. So now to use it, we need to render a map here in this area here, in the map div here, in index.html. And for that, I'll again create a new class, a new file in the UI folder, which I'll name map.js. And in there, I want to create a class, map, which will be responsible for rendering our map. Now in this class, we can add a constructor, because what do we need to render a map and a place on it? We need the coordinates of that place. So here I'll expect to get the coordinates, and then I want to render the map on the screen based on these coordinates. So I'll add a render method here in the map class, and I want to call this render here once the map is created, once this class is instantiated. And before we call render, however, I will store my coords in a coordinates property of this class instance. And instead of render, we now want to use the Google Maps JavaScript SDK to display a map on the screen. Now again, the official documentation, which I showed you earlier, is a great place to learn all about that. Here we will display a basic map. For this, I'll first of all check if we don't have access to a global Google variable. This is a global variable which is added by the Google Maps JavaScript SDK we're importing here. So we should have access to it everywhere in all the scripts that come after this import here in our project. So in this script, we should have access to this variable. If we don't have access, I'll throw an alert. Could not load maps library. Please try again later, to tell the user that something went wrong and at the moment we can't render the map. And thereafter I will return so that the lines after this if statement don't execute. If we make it past this if statement, however, we know Google Maps was loaded correctly and we can start working on the map. And working on a map is really, really simple. All we gotta do here is we call new Google so using this global Google variable .maps.map. So in the end here we got a class or a constructor function provided by the Google Maps package, which we instantiate. Now to this map constructor here, we have to pass the element, the DOM element in which we want to render the map. In my case, that is this div here with the ID map. So we can select this div by its ID, of course, and pass a reference to this div to this map constructor here. So for that, we can use document get element by ID map here, whoops, with a lowercase m, and forward that to the map constructor by the Google Maps package. You can also pass a second argument where you can configure the map, for example, on which place it should be zoomed in at the beginning. And there my center, you can set a center property here in this object, should be my coordinates, because this center property, and you learn all about that in the official docs, expects an object with a let and a long key. And that's exactly what I want to pass into my constructor here later, so that we can use that here. We can also set a zoom property here in this configuration object and set this to 16 to be zoomed in a bit on this map we render. Now I will store this map here in a constant map, and I also want to add a marker to it, so a pin which we place on the map. We can do this with new Google Maps.marker, so instantiating this constructor function here, which is also provided by the Google Maps package. And to that, you pass in an object where you configure where to place that marker and how it should look like. And again, in the official documentation, you learn way more about how you can configure such a marker in detail. You find a link to that attached to this lecture, by the way. And here I'll just set the position to this coordinates again to place the marker right in the center of the map. And then we have to also tell Google Maps on which map this marker should be placed, because it's not natural that this should be this map. This marker is created totally standalone from this map. So we have to add a map property in the marker configuration and point at this map constant here, so that we tell Google Maps that this marker should be placed in this map. And with that, we should have everything we need here. We can now create this class here, instantiate it, and hopefully render a map on the screen. So for that, we just need to export this class, and then we can import it in share place, of course. And here in share place, I'll add a new method, maybe here below the constructor, doesn't really matter though, and I'll call it select place, and I expect to get my coordinates here as an argument. And in here, I then want to render my map. So we can import map from ./UI/map. So from this map file we just worked in. And then here, I want to create a new map and forward my coordinates. And this should be an object with a let and a long key, which I actually create down there. So we got exactly what we need. So we forward this here. And I now want to store this map, which we create, this map instance, however, in a property named map in the place finder. And I'm doing that so that when we call select place, we can check if we already got a map, in which case I actually want to reuse the current map, or if we don't. So if we already have a map, then I actually want to call this map render, so this method we have in there, and only create a new map if we didn't create one in the past, so that if we get the user location twice in a row, we don't create a brand new map object all the time, but instead we reuse the existing one and just render a new Google map on it, so to say. For that, we just have to make sure that the render method in the map is a bit more flexible and we can forward the coordinates to it directly, so that in our map here, in map.js, when we call render, we expect to get the coordinates here as an input, and we therefore forward coords here to the render method instead of storing it in a property, which we don't need now, so that we can call it from both in the constructor and from outside of the class. And then here we use coordinates instead of this coordinates, also down there. And this allows us to create a new Google map, either in an already existing instance of our map class here or in a brand new instance. If you wanted to, you could also dive into the Google Maps JavaScript SDK documentation to find out how you can use an existing map, which you might already have, an existing Google map, which you can store in a property of the map class as well, of course, and just zoom to a new location if you wanted to do that. This is also something you could do. It's not something I'll do here though, because I don't want to primarily focus on Google Maps, but on JavaScript in general. So I'm fine with just creating a new Google map here. The old one will be dropped from memory anyways as soon as we don't need it anymore. So with that, back to SharePlace.js, we render our map in the end here with the help of the coordinates we got. And now we just need to call selectPlace from inside our success result method. So instead of console logging the coordinates, we can call selectPlace and forward the coordinates. And with all that work, if we save that and we go back to our application, we should be able to click on Get Current Location, and it spins. And once it's done spinning, it should actually render this, but I'm getting an error. This selectPlace is not a function. And do you know what could be the issue here? Well, the issue is that we're using the this keyword here, right? We do this in the end in locate user handler. We do it here in this anonymous function, but I'm using an arrow function here. So this inside of the arrow function, as you learned, has the same context as outside of it. Outside of the arrow function means inside of this method. And what does this refer to inside of the locate user handler? For that, we need to analyze how locate user handler is called. And it is called here when we click on this button. So it's called upon this event. And you learned about this early in the course. When we have an event listener that calls a method, this inside of this method or function does not refer to the surrounding context here. Instead, this refers to the target of the event. To change this, we need to call bind here and bind this inside of locate user handler to this, so to the this keyword in this line here, which means this as it is defined in the constructor, which indeed is our class and the instance based on it. So with bind this, we ensure that the this keyword inside of locate user handler refers to the class instance and not to some DOM element which triggered this event. We will, by the way, later need the same for submitting this form, so we can already bind this as well. And now with that, if we save that, and we again click on Get Current Location, it loaded super fast, and it renders something on the screen, zoomed in quite a bit, because I'm in the middle of nowhere, as it seems like. If I get a new location, I'm even in the ocean here. And that's, of course, because I randomize my location. You should really get the pin in the location where you're at. So this works, however, that's the main takeaway. We can render our map here. That is working. We can render our Google map here, which we can display. And therefore, we got that working in exactly the way it should work. With that out of the way, let's now make sure we can also enter an address here, a street name, and find that address and display it on the map as well. So let's make sure that finding a user address works, or an entered address. And we'll do that in the find address handler here, of course. For that, we need to do a couple of things. We need to get access to what the user entered here. We need to prevent the default so that submitting the form doesn't actually submit it and doesn't try to send a request to the server. We then need to reach out to Google's servers and translate a user entered address into coordinates, latitude and longitude. This is how you express places, coordinates on a map or in a geographic way in general. So let's start simple. We will get the event argument here, and we can call prevent default on that to prevent the submission of the form. Next, I want to get the address the user entered. And we can get this by using event target, which will be our form. That's the target which triggered the event in the end. And there we can use query selector to get the input in the form. And I only have one input in there, so we'll get that input then. Now I'm not interested in the entire input, I'm just interested in the value the user entered, so we can access .value here to get that value. Now we can do a little bit of validation here and check if we don't have an address somehow, or if we do have an address, but after trimming it, the length is 0, which means the user didn't enter something. And then I just show an alert where I say invalid address entered, please try again. and I return. If we make it past this if check, we know we have a valid address, or at least we have some text. We can try to look it up. So here, I will again show my loading spinner then, create a new modal, and point at the same content I have up there, loading modal content. We can actually take both arguments we have up there, and we could therefore also refactor this into its own method, but I'll just do it like this. And I will call show here to show that spinner. Next, we need to make sure that we reach out to Google's servers, because they do have an API for us which we can use to translate the entered address, which could be something like a street name, into coordinates. And I don't want to do this here in this class. This class should be focused on working with the inputs and so on. Instead, I'll create a new folder, utility, and you can name this however you want, and in there I'll create a location.js file. And this should be a file which holds utility methods for getting coordinates for an address, for example. So in here, in the location.js file, we can add a new method or a new function now, just like this. Doesn't have to be in a class. Get coords from address would be a fitting name, where we get an address as an argument, and this should be a function, and we then make a HTTP request in here and, well, return the coordinates. Now I want to export this function so that we can use it from outside this file as well, and I will add the async keyword inside of it, because we will use a promise in here. We will send a HTTP request, and I want to use that async await syntax you learned about in the course to have this more readable promise syntax instead of using then and catch. But of course you could use then and catch as you learned it in the async code section. Now in here we need to send a request, and we need to send this to Google's servers. To be precise, we'll need the geocoding API Google offers. And if you Google for Google geocoding API, you should find the official docs here. Now as always, here you can learn all about that, and you will need an API key and a working project for all of that. But with that, we can just copy this example URL here by clicking this copy button, and send a request to this with our real address for which we want to get coordinates. So we can use the fetch API here, which of course not all browsers support. So we might want to use a library like Axios instead. But here, to also practice fetching again, I'll go with that. And send a request to this URL. Whoops, enter it as a string here. Now actually, I'll not enter it as a string, but as a template literal, so that we can inject content into the string easily, because there are a couple of parts that we'll need to replace. For example, the address. This is a dummy address which is getting looked up here, Google headquarters. And we can replace this entire part here with our actual address. So here I'll inject some content. Same for the API key. We need to replace that, and I want to inject it because I will set up a global constant here, Google API key, where I want to store that key. And that can be the same key as you're using in your index.html file. So here you can grab this key, which we added there earlier, and add this here in this constant in the location.js file as a string. And then we can use the Google API key here as a key, which is injected into this dynamically generated string. Now for the address, I want to use the address we're getting here, but one important note, since it will be part of a URL, we have to make sure that it's converted such that white space or special characters are translated into a URL-friendly encoding. And for that, we got a helpful utility function built into JavaScript, or exposed by the browser in JavaScript, I should say, and that's the encode URI function. It's globally available, made available by the browser. We can pass in a string, and we get a URL-friendly string back. So here I got my URL address, which we can now inject into our string here. And with that, we should send a request to a URL that works there. It should be a GET request, so we don't need to configure it in any other way. And instead, we can just await it, because I'm using async here, and store the response in a constant. Of course, as I mentioned, you could use then and catch as well. Now, if the response is not okay, then we know we have an error. So I want to throw a new error here, where I say failed to fetch coordinates. Please try again. If that's not the case, I want to extract the response data. by awaiting response JSON. And now that should be our coordinates data, but, and that's a Google specific thing, it could also fail without using a error status code, so without making it into this if block. And we can tell if it failed if we have a error message property in the response body. So it will have a 200 status code, and still it might have such an error message which signals that it failed. So in this case, I also want to throw a new error using this built-in error constructor function JavaScript provides. And there, use the error message as an error message I forward. So the error constructor function here is really built into JavaScript and globally available there. If we make it past all these if checks, we know we have a successful response and we get the response data, which should hold the coordinates. Now we can console log the data here to get a feeling for its structure. Of course, that's also something you find in the official docs, though it will look something like this. And in there, what you'll have is a results key, which is an array, and the first element of the array is itself an object, which will have a geometry property, which will be an object with a location property, which will be an object with latitude and longitude. And that's the thing I'm interested in. So to extract this here, we can get our coordinates by accessing data results, and there the first array element, as I just explained, there the geometry key, and there the location key. And that will then be an object with the lat and long keys. And I want to return these coordinates, this coordinates object, as part of this getCoords_from_address function. And now we can use this in share place. So we added this getCoords_from_address function. Let's now use it in share place. There, when we have the address entered by the user, I want to, well, try to convert it to coordinates. So for that, let's import this function we just created from /utility, /location, and the function name was getCoords_from_address. And let's call this function in the findAddressHandler method, getCoords_from_address, and forward that address which we retrieved here from the user input. Now this will return a promise because we're using async await in there, and as you learned, the entire function which you use async await in will return a promise. So we should add then here to actually get the response, or what I will do, use async await on this method as well. You can use async await there as well, because in the end it's just a normal function, just being part of a class. We can add the async keyword here, so that here in front of getCoords_from_address we can await instead of using then and catch. Now we'll get the coordinates here ultimately, and we can store this in a constant, so that thereafter we can call this select place and forward the coordinates. And we'll forward coordinates in exactly the same format we would get them if we auto-locate the user. Now of course this might fail though. We're throwing a couple of errors in here after all, if certain things go wrong. So we should also wrap this into try catch. If you're not using async await, you would use a catch block simply, and catch any potential errors we might be getting here, so that we can simply throw an alert where we display the error message. The built-in error constructor function gives you an object which has a message property where this message you're passing in here to the constructor will be stored in. So I can display these messages to the user in an alert now if something fails here. Otherwise, we should hopefully get the coordinates and display them. And thereafter I'll call modal hide. This is not getting executed right away because we have a wait in there. So since we have a wait in there, we'll wait for this to finish before the other lines execute, because all the other lines thereafter, as you learned, are in the end just wrapped into an invisible then block, because we just use promises here, just invisibly converted from then and catch to await and try catch. So lots of work. Let's save that and let's give it a try. Here, let's enter a street like 6th Avenue and click on find place, and we get the spinner. And if everything works correctly, you should get this output here where the marker is somewhere in 6th Avenue. And of course, you could enter a more detailed address here, your own address maybe, to see whether that works as well. You can also write New York here, and Google really does its best to locate this and find the right location. So with that, we get this functionality added as well. Now, as a next step, I want to make sure that based on this, we now always get an address, even if we auto-locate the user, which we're currently not doing, we're not getting an address for that, and that we then show a shareable link here, which we can use to, well, in the end, open this page here and start on such a map with the marker placed in there. So let's start by making sure that we can not just get the coordinates for an address, but also the address for coordinates we might enter, so that we store both the coordinates and the address, because I want to have both for then displaying this to the user when we have this shareable link. So in the location utility file here, we can add another function, either in front or below the other function, doesn't matter. Another async function, which I'll also export, which I'll name getAddress for or from coords. So basically the opposite. Here I expect to get some coordinates, an object with a latitude and longitude, or a lat and L and G key, and then we will use the same Google API to get the address. Because this Google API works in both directions. We can also do a reverse lookup and pass in coordinates and get back an address, and that's exactly what I want to do here. So we can copy this link here actually, and then in here just set up a fetch request, again with a template literal, so that we can conveniently inject information into this string. And we need to replace your API key here with the Google API key constant we created. And then the latitude here, up to the comma, excluding the comma, with something, and the longitude after the comma, up to the key here. Now for the latitude, I want to enter coords.lat. Coords should be an object with a lat property, and coords.lng, so that we forward this information into this string and set up a correct URL. Now since we use async, we can again await this and store our response here. And now I'll just copy this check I'm performing down there, because I need the same check here, and that should be response. And here I'll just say failed to fetch address. And therefore, after these if checks, I know that this worked and we should have an address. Now, how do we get the address? If we have a look at this example response, we see it's an object, again with a results key, which is an array. And the first element in the array has this formatted address field, which is exactly what I need. So here we can get the address by accessing data.results, the first result, .formatted underscore address. And that's then what I will return here. And since we use async await, this is in the end what this invisibly created promise will resolve to. So now we can call getAddress from coords in share place here when we locate the user. So here, before I call select place, I will get the address here by awaiting, and for that to work, we need to add async in front of locate user handler. So by awaiting the call to get address from coords, which we need to import from the location file, so that down there we can call get address from coords and forward the coordinates object we are constructing here. And I actually only want to hide my modal after that is done as well. So now I got the address here as well, and now I will forward the address here to select place. Also, in our other method, in the find address handler, select place should here not only get the coordinates, but also the address, which we have here as well. Here the user entered it. And I'm doing this so that select place now accepts both arguments here. And we can now set up a shareable link, which will lead us to that second HTML file in the end, where we display the address and the map with the coordinates. So now here, let's work on select place. In select place, I don't just want to render the map, but also create this shareable link and output the shareable link here in this input, so that when we click the share place button, we do actually copy it into the clipboard. So with that, let's go back to the share place.js file. And in there, let's get access to the share button. That's the first step. So here I need the share button, and I can get access to it with document. And then this share button does have an ID, share button. So we can get access with document, get element by ID, share button here, just like this. Now actually, I want to set this up in the constructor though, where we also get access to the other buttons and so on. But I will store it in a property, not in a constant. Still here, I want to add a listener, an event listener, a click listener, and we'll hook this up to a method in a second. So for now, we just get access to the share button here. We can then use this in select place. Because initially this button should be disabled, and it is because I set the disabled attribute here. So in share place JS, now that we got an address, I will set this share button disabled to false to enable it. So to set this disabled property to false. Now I want to get access to that share link input. So to this input element here next to the button. And this has an ID of share link. So we can select it by this ID by using document get element by ID share link. And on this share link input element here, maybe name it element at the end, I want to set the value to a link which I now want to construct. I'll do this as a template literal so that we can build this in a more powerful way, in an easier way, which makes it easy to build a string with dynamic values. And there I want to start with the current server address. And we can get this by accessing the location object you learned about earlier in the course, and there the origin property. This gives us our current domain. So in our case here, localhost 8080. Thereafter, I want to add a slash, and then, for example, my-place, and this can't be anything. This should be the name of this subfolder, so that in the end, when we then later visit this link, we load that index.html file in that subfolder, so my-place, and then add a so-called query parameter with a question mark, so that's basically some extra data we can add in the URL, which we then can read from that URL in that other page we'll be loading later. And there I want to set an address key equal to, and now basically set this to the address I'm getting here, but again encode it to work in a URL, which we can do dynamically with encode URI, as you learned. Whoops, URI, capital R and I. Pass in the address here. And then after this, add an ampersand symbol to add another optional query parameter to the URL, which should be let, which I set equal to coordinates.let, and then again ampersand lng set equal to coordinates.lng. So with that, I basically encode all that data into this URL, which I construct here. Now with that, let's save that and see it in action. And I'm getting an error that I can't use await outside of an async function. So where are we using await? Well, my bad. Of course, locate user handler, that being marked as async doesn't help us because await is not directly part of locate user handler, it's part of this anonymous function. So this anonymous function needs to be marked as async. I think that's a good mistake to happen actually, because it makes it really clear that the direct function in which you want to use await needs to be marked as async, not some other function around it, the function in which you directly use it. So this function here needs the async keyword for await to work in it. So now with that, if we save that, I get an error regarding the event listener. That makes sense. Let's comment it out for the moment here in the constructor of placefinder. And now with that, if we save that, if I get my location, for example, you see now this URL is constructed here, and we can click share place, which for the moment won't do anything, because that's the next thing. I want to make sure that when we click share place, we copy this link into the clipboard. So let's copy the link into the clipboard, and for that, of course, we can use the clipboard API. I briefly touched on this already in earlier modules. If you search for MDN Clipboard API, you can learn more about it, and most importantly, you'll learn that browser support is mixed. So we should definitely check whether it is supported by the browser we're running our code in before we just blindly use it. So first of all, I'll comment in this add event listener code here in the constructor and point at a, let's say, share place handler method. This share place handler. Now we have to add such a method here, maybe directly below the constructor, for that to work. And in there, I now want to use the clipboard API, of course. So I'll first of all check if navigator clipboard is not a thing, which means the browser does not support it, in which case I want to return and not continue, and instead, as a fallback, just select the text. so that at least the user just has to press Ctrl+C and doesn't have to select the full URL. Now to select the URL, I need access to the input. For that, we can copy that code here where we get access to that input element. Of course, we could have also therefore initialized it here in the constructor and stored it in a property if you wanted to. Here I'll just copy it, and then in here in the if statement, set or call shared link input element select. We trigger the select event here, which in the end selects the entire content in there and marks it. Just to prove that it works, let's do it outside of this if check. And let's then get the current location so that such a link gets generated. And now if I click share place, you see this is selected. So now I just have to press Ctrl+C, which is better than nothing. But of course, if the browser supports it, I want to take that one step further and not just do this as a fallback in this if check, but if we make it past this if check, we know we have support for the clipboard API. Then I want to use navigator clipboard and call write text, this write text method on the clipboard object, and write my text, which is in that input, into the clipboard of the user. So shared link input element dot value. That's the link we generated, and that's now stored in a clipboard of the user. Now this returns a promise, and we could use async await. Just to mix it up here, I will use then and catch. And in the then block, we know that this succeeded. So here I'll just throw an alert, copy it into clipboard so that we get some feedback. And here we might get an error, which I will just log here to the console. We could then, as a fallback, since it failed, at least mark it again. So now with that, if we save all of that and I clear my clipboard by copying something else, you see, now I got enabled in my clipboard. Now if I click get current location, still got enabled there. If I now click share place, it's copied into clipboard, and indeed, here it is. So now this worked, now I got this in my clipboard, and now the only missing thing is that if I visit this page here, we load a new page, as you can tell. We load that other index.html file in the my place folder. Here I want to show the address here in the header and render the map here. Share a new place always takes us back to this page, so I just want to make these two things work now, and we'll be done for this little demo application here. So let's make sure that when we visit this my place index.html file, we do actually render the address here in the header in the h1 tag, and we do render the map. For that, we can use the my place JavaScript file, which is the file loaded in that index.html file. And in here, I will create a new class, place, or maybe loaded place, however you want to name it. And there in the constructor, I expect to get the coordinates and the address. So the two pieces of information we can get from the URL in the end. Because keep in mind that this link which is generated has the address encoded in the URL, and it has the coordinates encoded in the URL. Now in there, I then want to build a new map, so we can import map from the UI folder, from the map file there, and build a new map here by forwarding coordinates. I also want to output the address in my header, so for that we can access the header title and store it in a constant with document query selector header h1. This is a CSS selector which selects the first h1 element in the first header element on the page. And here I got exactly one header element with one h1 element, so of course we'll select this one. And now here in the header title element, if you want to call it like this, header title L, I'll set text content, so I'll set the text node in there equal to the address we're getting. Now after this, we can instantiate this, and we have to parse some data from the URL. So we'll call new place, new loaded place, but I'll need to forward coordinates and address, and that is part of the URL and needs to be parsed. For that again, JavaScript and the browser got us covered. We haven't used it before, but we'll use it now. There is a built-in URL constructor function or class, however you want to call it. So you can create a new object with new. To that, you can pass a URL, and I want to pass the current URL, which, as you learned earlier, is stored in location.ref. This is the current location, the current URL, which is loaded in the browser. I pass this to this built-in URL constructor function, and it creates an object with options for us to get information out of that URL. That's what this URL utility class provided by the browser does. So I'll store it in a constant here. And now we can get our query parameters, as it's called, stored in a query params constant maybe, by accessing url.searchParams. This is simply provided by this built-in object here, by this built-in class. So this will be our dynamic options here, so the thing after the question mark basically, stored as key value pairs in query params now, thanks to search params. So stored as key value pairs in search params, so to say. And then we can get our coords here, create a new object, where we have a let key, which is query params, and there we have a get method, and then get the let argument. So with that we're saying, hey, I want to get the value which is stored for this let identifier in my URL, which is this number here in the end. And of course I'll repeat the same for the longitude. So I'll add a longitude here and get it from query params get lng. Now important, what's retrieved here will always be a string. However, I need a number here, and we can convert it to a number by adding a plus, or by using parse float, of course. That also works. You can do both. So I'll do both here to show you both. So with that, we get the coordinates. For the address, well, I will store that in a constant and get it from query params, and there get address. And what you get here, of course, have to be the keys you find in your URL. So here I'm getting the value for the address key, so the value after this equal sign, which is this address here in the end. And this is then retrieved and automatically parsed to a human readable format. So from that URI optimized format to a human readable one. And then we can forward both here to loaded place to this constructor. With that, if we now save that and we reload this page, I get an error that Google is not defined, which makes sense because I'm using the map in here. And for that, of course, I use the Google Maps API. Now that's imported in our root index.html file with this script import, but not imported in our myplace index.html file. So of course we should add that import before we add our own script here too. So let's add that Google Maps JavaScript SDK import with our API key entered here in the index.html file in the myplace folder, so that we do have access to the Google Maps API in all the scripts that belong to this file as well. With that, if we now reload this, this still fails. The reason for that is that here we got async on the Google Maps import. We actually should remove that. It can result to the Google Maps script loading too late, and then our script might execute before Google Maps was loaded. So let's remove that so that we only have the fur and they are executed in order, and therefore now this works. And here you see that location which is shared is loaded here. And if I share the 6th Avenue, find that place, click on share place here, got the link, enter that link here, we got that here. So this is now working, and I mistyped here, but this is now working, and this is our finished application here, with Google Maps being used, with a couple of browser APIs being used, with browser support ensured by us with certain if checks, where we check if the clipboard API is available and so on, and with async await used with promises, with a lot of async code in general, with the fetch APIs, with a lot of features you learned about earlier in this course, all coming together in this little demo application, which hopefully therefore is a good practice and shows you how the different pieces work together.